Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to the University of Sheffield if you're a visitor. This is going to be a unique event. My name is Allan Pacey and I'm Professor of Andrology in the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health. And if you're wondering what andrology is, you're about to find out. Now, I say this is a unique event for two reasons. First, because of the subject matter. Life after death, the woman's victory in having her deceased husband's children, is a truly unique story. And tonight we've assembled four of the main people who were involved in those events. But second, this evening is a unique collaboration between the University of Sheffield and the Progress Educational Trust. Now, I'm very pleased to be an employee of the University of Sheffield, but I'm also very pleased to be a trustee of the Progress Educational Trust. So before we begin, I would like you to know a little more about that organisation, and I'd like to invite to the stage its director, Sarah Norcross.
Thank you very much, Allan. So, Progress Educational Trust is a charity we were founded back in 1992 to advance public understanding of science, law and ethics in the fields of human reproduction, genetics and stem cell and embryology. And the Progress Educational Trust aims to improve choices for people who are affected by fertility issues and by genetic conditions. And we do this by promoting the responsible application of science and by engaging with the public about the issues that this science raises. And so there are three main areas of our work: leading the debate, so identifying challenging topics and providing the forum and encouraging meaningful public discussion; by influencing policy so that it's better aligned with the science and reflects the best interest of patients and the public; and by informing and explaining, so holding events like this one and publishing accurate and unbiased news in our online publication BioNews. There are so many amazing stories in the fields of assisted reproduction and genetics that need and deserve to be told and retold and preserved so that we understand how this sector has evolved over the years. And this is the first in what we hope will be a series of events looking at these sorts of issues, so these landmark events in the air, and we want to try and hold them in an area of the country that has a particular connection to that happening. And Sheffield is at the heart of Diane Blood's story. And in fact, given her amazing tenacity and her determination and courage that she had to have in order to realise her and Stephen's dream of a family, I wonder whether these events could have happened anywhere other than Yorkshire, because it sort of typifies what the sort of stereotype of someone from Yorkshire. So, in your packs, you have lots of information about the panel, their biographies, and lots of information about Progress Educational Trust. You also have an evaluation form, and we'd be hugely, hugely grateful if you can fill that in and hand it in at the end. Because, as I said, this is the first event of this type that we've held, and so we really need your feedback more than ever. We are a charity, and we will be doing a whip round at the end, so if you can spare a few pounds, you can put some in the collection tin, and we'd be very grateful. Every little helps, as Tesco say, and that's certainly true in our case. We're hugely grateful to the University of Sheffield, to Polly and her team who we've been dealing with. It's been a joy to work with you. I've never done an event where I've been able to talk to the speakers so much in advance without running around trying to do other things, so it's wonderful. And to Welcome, who've sponsored this event, so it's thanks to them for the wine in particular. So there's a few little items of housekeeping. There are no planned fire alarm drills, so if the alarm goes off, it is a real thing, and we need to leave by the nearest exit, and the concourse outside is the muster point. Please, as a courtesy to the speakers tonight, put your mobile phones onto silent. If you want to tweet about the event, then please do. The hashtags on the slide up there, hashtag Diane Blood. And the event is being filmed. The film will appear online in due course. If you're in the audience and you don't want to appear in the film, then please let one of the events team know at the end. So, finally, before we start, I would like to thank the panel speakers and Allan for chairing it. And I'm really excited and really looking forward to hearing about the events that started here in Sheffield all those years ago. So I'll hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And 20 years ago, widow Diane Blood won the legal right to conceive a child using the sperm of her deceased husband, Stephen Blood. The whole event is charged with emotion, ethical debate, legal complexity, but at its very heart is a very human story. With me on stage is Diane Blood, who lives near Sheffield, who spent many years working in the advertising industry, but who describes her greatest achievement as being mother to Liam and Joel, her miraculous boys conceived after their father's sudden and untimely death. Diane, thank you for coming. To Diane's left, your right, is Ian Cooke, now the Emeritus Professor of Obstetrics and Gynaecology at the University of Sheffield, but 20 years ago was the head of the University Department of Obstetrics and Gynaecology, and as you will hear, had a pivotal role in this story. Ian, thank you for coming. To my left, your right, is Michael Fordham QC from Blackstone Chambers in London, and who 20 years ago was part of Diane Blood's legal team and was the barrister. Michael, thank you for coming north and coming out of London to Sheffield. And finally, to Michael's left and your far right is Liam Blood, Diane's eldest son, now 18 years old, and I'm delighted to say he's just commenced a degree apprenticeship in digital and technology solutions with Sheffield Hallam University. Liam, thank you for coming. I'd like to begin, if I may, with you, Diane. I'd like the audience to know a little about Diane Blood. Not Diane Blood the hashtag, but Diane Blood the person. Could you take us back 20, 25 years to what life was like? Tell us what you were as a person then.
I think I had a fairly inconspicuous life, really. I was Mrs. Average, and nothing special, really. I was Miss Goody Two-Shoes at school, I always did what I was told, and then suddenly my life took a dramatic turn and I suddenly became a rebel.
In what way?
Well, when my husband suddenly was taken ill and obviously subsequently died, which was extremely rapid, I was faced with circumstances of having to, I suppose, react very quickly, ask for what I wanted and what he would have wanted very quickly. And fortunately, we managed to get a message to Jessup Hospital, and Professor Cooke was then dealing with it. So it was a sudden turn where everybody reacted very quickly and everybody put the things in motion that started a huge legal battle, and then suddenly I had to start fighting.
So you met Stephen when you were 16, I think. Was that, you had quite a long relationship before you were married?
Yes, I was still at school in the sixth form when I met him. He was working. We've been together 12 years at the point at which he died. But I mean, I've been to college and we stayed together throughout that time. And then obviously we were married, and we just got to the point where we were trying to conceive children naturally. And in fact, there was some talk of whether I actually might be pregnant, but whether that was true or not, or you know, we don't know. It obviously subsequently wasn't, and then obviously, you know, he died very suddenly.
So as a couple, you were certainly trying for a family. I got the sense from your book, although I don't think you said it explicitly, that you felt you were pregnant at the time that Stephen became.
Well, I didn't know. I came in, it was a little late, and it was that. Be hopeful, might it be? So
And as a couple, how had you discussed your family plans? Was that something that you discussed overtly, or was it kind of assumed that this was the right moment for you to start?
I think it's always been discussed from when we first met. I was a single child, my husband had 2 sisters. He was quite keen on a big family, so I wanted to make sure that his girlfriend had similar view to him. So it was just something we'd always discussed from when I first met him.
So the weekend that Stephen became ill, in your book, is a very harrowing read, I have to say. I guess what went through my mind as I was reading it is it wouldn't feel to me, and I don't wish this to sound dispassionate, but it wouldn't feel to me the first thoughts of my husband is dying, is there a way of preserving his sperm? Could you crystallise those thoughts a little bit for us? How did that make an appearance in your mind at what was a very stressful and emotional time?
Well, obviously for a start, I didn't expect him to die. I fully expected for a start that he'd go into hospital, he'd be given some medicine and he'd get better. It was a very, very dramatic few days. Obviously there was the hopes as well that I could have been pregnant and what we were hoping for, and he suddenly took a turn for the worse. He actually had a cardiac arrest and they restarted his heart, and so in amongst all those things that were going off, and also talk about they were giving me antibiotics because I was in close contact with somebody who got meningitis. I was being asked, was I pregnant, because actually the antibiotics could have caused me to lose the baby if I was. And so we were having those kind of conversations for other reasons other than actually, suddenly, do you know what, I just think we'll ask if we can take some sperm. It was an ongoing conversation with doctors throughout that time about what we hoped, and also huge amounts of antibiotics, as I understood it at that time, can cause infertility as well. So the conversations about babies were happening before the point at which I thought maybe he wouldn't make it. But even when we took the sperm, I still hoped that he'd make it. The doctors were telling me, I mean, he was in a coma at the time, but they were still saying, just keep talking to him. Hearing's, the last thing to go, and it wasn't definitely this is the end. He could have recovered, and I just kind of thought then it was a sensible thing to have done anyway. So it was a 2-pronged thing.
Thank you. Behind the scenes, the doctors in the intensive care unit must have been making contact with you, Ian. Can you describe that first contact that you had with me?
No, they didn't actually.
Pacey, you learned something new 20 years later.
Tell us how it was.
Well, I was doing a clinic and the telephone rang. It's for you, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We have a chap here who's had meningitis. Unfortunately, he lost consciousness within 24 hours. He's not going to recover. And we're going to turn the respirator off in an hour's time. Can you collect some sperm? So it's a pretty dramatic statement. And I had a little background, apart from the clinical story, because I had been a member of the HFEA when it was initially set up. But that had been some 4 or 5 years earlier, and as it happened, I was one of the group of 3 that had written the code of practice. I was the only clinician on the group, and we had actually thought about the possibility that someone who had a diagnosis of cancer, which was the only clinical scenario that we had thought about, knew he was going to die and could seek an opportunity in the future for recovery of sperm. So we thought that the scenario was that an individual would have lots of notice, plenty of time to organise, to think it through, to talk, to discuss, to counsel, etc., and would eventually sign it And so it was perfectly logical that there should be signed consent for such a retrieval. And that went through my mind immediately, and I said, is there signed consent? And the answer was no. How do you know that that's a legitimate request? And, oh, his wife wants the sperm retrieved. Okay. The other part of the background was that by sheer chance, I had a PhD student who was a urologist, and he was recovering sperm from men who'd had spinal cord transections, paralysed from the waist down, to recover sperm, and they were still alive, and the sperm could be used for future insemination of their partners. And so I knew we had the technology to do it. I knew that the way the code of practice was structured, it was not legal to do that, because it was a prerequisite to have sperm consent. But I thought, I have one chance here, and we had never thought of this scenario. The one we had thought of was utterly different, and it seems rational, and out of sheer humanity, I should do this. And if there's a problem, well, I'll have to talk my way out of it if it's possible. So I put the phone on. It was a fairly brief telephone call, and I telephoned the HFEA, and it was about 4:20 by that stage, and there was no answer from the chief executive. I presume she'd gone home at 4:20 in the afternoon. So I rang the next morning and explained the situation, and Flora said, you acted illegally. That was my direct response, her direct response. So I said, well, if, she said, you must throw the sperm away. I said, I can't do that. If I acted illegally, throwing the sperm away does not make my action legal. So I might as well hang on in there and get this sorted out, and we'll, and besides that, I couldn't possibly meet the wife and tell her that today. I'll make an appointment to see her in 6 weeks' time. She at least needs that time to grieve, to think about it and discuss it, and then we can have a discussion and I'll break the news to her. And that was that. So we made the appointment to see Diane 6 weeks later, and she came along with her father, and they were very polite. They introduced themselves and said, this is what we'd like. And I said, I'm sorry, I can't do this. It's not legal. And they said, we thought you'd say that. We have one request. Would you not throw out the sample until the legal processes have been played out, because we're going to seek judicial review. Well, if I'd acted illegally, it was still illegal. It wasn't changed by that. So why shouldn't I do that? And so I agreed. And then I waited to hear what would happen on the legal side.
So I think what's really interesting about that is I don't think it's often recognised that you didn't make this decision in isolation, you did seek an opinion from the HFEA. And I after reading Diane's book, there's a line there that it was written in a file note in the HFEA's documents that Flora had said it would appear uncaring and unnecessarily bureaucratic to insist on proper legal consent. That kind of supports in some way the action that you took. So the HFEA were not exactly.
I think there was some talks as well of it was necessary to find out if consent had been given in any form at any time. That was on an attendance note, which, although I'm just saying about the story of babies being very much at the foremost of conversations in the hospital, it would have been a bit bizarre to suddenly pull straight out of thin air, oops, I'd like you to take some sperm when I have no idea whether this is possible. But one of the amazing coincidences, of which there are millions throughout my story, was that my husband and I had read a story about where somebody had, I can't remember whether it was trying for the baby or had actually conceived a baby after their husband had died. So one of those cases that we're talking about where it was cancer, and so hence I thought I knew that it was possible to take sperm. Obviously I didn't quite realise at the time that it might be slightly different when somebody was in a coma, and I knew that it was possible to store, and I knew it was possible to conceive after somebody had died. From this conversation with my husband, the story, or indeed stories, there were several in newspapers just before the time, and obviously we discussed those and discussed them as an ethical debate. And what would you do? Would you have a baby after I die? What do you think? Just a conversation that you just had over a newspaper article.
Michael, can I turn to you?
Yeah.
What was the legal issue that prevented Diane from using the sperm that had been taken?
Well, it was pretty straightforward, actually. What you did was illegal. You were told that, and you knew that. And it was illegal because English law was pretty straightforward on this. And it wasn't what the courts had said. It was in the legislation, it wasn't in rules. It was in primary legislation enacted by Parliament. And what it said was, you cannot store sperm without a written consent from the person that and it was.
Michael, can I interject there, because I didn't think that was in primary legislation. I thought this was in the regulations created by the HFEA, which were subsequently laid before Parliament and approved by Parliament.
Okay, well, we can check that point, but it was in the legislation, and there was no way around it as a matter of English law. There was a code of practice, but that's a bit easier to get around. But what you couldn't get around as a matter of English law was the legislation. I think it was in the primary legislation, but certainly we couldn't get around it as a matter of English law. Have we got any lawyers here?
Was it Schedule 3 of the Act of Parliament?
There you go.
Schedule 3.
Schedule 3, yeah.
Because if it had been in secondary legislation, we would have had a shot in an English court with domestic arguments, because unreasonable rules could be set aside. How many other lawyers here? Any practicing lawyers? Any academic lawyers? Any student lawyers? Okay, this is good for me to know. By the way, I've come home. I was born in Sheffield, so
But we had the situation that, okay, we can argue the finer points of law, was this illegal or not?
Oh, and we did. We did argue the finer points of law.
But the sample existed, and there was no going back from that point. So surely if we'd had a sympathetic regulator or a sympathetic judge, it would have been relatively easy to make a legal argument to allow Diane permission to use the sperm either in the UK or elsewhere.
I mean, the legal arguments are very difficult. But the case started, I think, for two reasons. The first is because of that conversation that you had, Diane, with Stephen, where you'd read a magazine article. And that had two consequences. One was you knew, it was on your radar, and so you asked because you knew it was a thing, as some would say. It was something that was possible that medicine could do. And the second reason why I think that was relevant was because although the law was clear, it was also pretty stupid, because we were able to say from the start, as you were able to say from the start, as you would have known from the start, that this accorded with Stephen's wishes. This is what he would have wanted. He can't sign his name on a form, he's unconscious. But we know it accords with his wishes. Why do we know that? Because they discussed this very scenario. Because in a forum, not like this in a lecture hall, in a magazine where stories get told, people talk about stories that get told, they talk about how it might impact them, that is what had happened. And so I think that was point number one. And they never, in the whole case, in the whole fight that we had, nobody ever, they came close to it once, but nobody ever said you were telling a lie about that. And they didn't say, prove it, how are you going to prove you had that conversation? So that was our starting point on the facts. And then the second thing, which is utterly miraculous, and I often thought about this, and you guys might want to think about this too, is what you did it's obvious to say it. But if someone had been on the end of the phone at 4 that day at the HFE, they would have said, you can't do this. I believe you would have done it anyway. But they've gone home. So. And, you know, lawyers can't do anything without people like you doing things like that. You know, really nothing. And I think that was a miraculous thing. And so for you to know, to ask, and for you to stick your neck out and say, you know what, I did it, I've done it, I'm not going to tell her no, I'm not going to throw it away, no. That's where this started. I know it's obvious to say it, but that's what I inherited.
It's also miraculous that we were in Sheffield, because we started out in a hospital in Worksop and my husband became more ill, and then there was some talk that they were going to send us to Mansfield. And then we got in an ambulance and then they said, no, you're going to Sheffield. So the fact that we were here where the experts were and the person with the knowledge of how to actually retrieve sperm in those circumstances was an amazing coincidence. We could have been in Mansfield. But no, we were in Sheffield. We're in luck.
Well, it was miraculous that Paul Tophill was doing a PhD on the subject, because if it had been to me alone, I wouldn't have known how to do that, because although in subsequent years that information has become widely available, that was not common knowledge at the time.
Michael, how easy was the case to fight?
Well, Diane was a very easy client. I remember that she came to me as a pile of papers, which is the way my clients come to me. You know, there's a file, and they get the solicitors met them, talk to them, and then they send the papers to me, and I open this file. And a lot of my papers are very dull. And I just remember this story, you couldn't put it down, and that was like that from the start. Even in legal papers, that is never true. And so I know, and as a client, when we did meet, and I was starting wringing my hands and doing the whole agonising percentages and prospects of success and how to, the thing lawyers do, which is it arguable, is it viable, you know, and you put it all into words and the client leaves thinking, what did that mean? So you try and put it into percentages, and I was just beginning to do that with Diane, and she just stopped me. She said, I don't need percentages. I just want to know if we can fight. Can we fight this? Which is the best client you can ever have. So, you know, the weight drops at that point. Yeah, we can fight this. And that's where it started. Legally, pretty difficult. Pretty miraculous, I think, from a legal perspective, which is part of the kind of story of the events here. But all because you took it. It was there. Shouldn't have been. It was there.
So there were many legal twists and turns. I mean, I think your first application was simply to the HFEA to say, can we do this? And the answer came back, no.
Yeah.
And then you had a judicial review.
Yeah, we did.
Which did not succeed.
That's right. We went to the president of the family division. We got an anonymity order to begin with. It was very sympathetic, but he just couldn't see a way past it. And the HFEA lawyered up. You know, they got some pretty smart lawyers, and it was a pretty straightforward case for them, frankly. We were always the away team, and we were really, it was always a long shot. But the idea, Diane, that you should say that, you know, you're goody two-shoes who obeyed the rules, that's not the Diane Blood I know. From the day I encountered Diane Blood, she's the opposite of that. And in fact, I'll tell you this, Liam. Sorry, can I digress?
You may have, absolutely.
Just digress for me, because you know, we're all friends. And I now know where the lawyers are, so at your christening, I did a little talk, you know, impromptu talk to the kids who were there. I got them all round, and I sat them all down, and you were there, and I don't know if you can remember this, I can remember this. And I just told them that sometimes rules are stupid rules. And if you encounter a stupid rule, sometimes, not always, I didn't want to get them into trouble, but sometimes the right thing to do is to break the rule. And you broke the rule, and you broke the rule, and the result of them breaking the rule was you and the right. And I told these kids this, because I thought so, and so I did this whole thing, Diane, you know, Diane, the rule breaker. So goody two-shoes, no.
Because I think what's remarkable, and you just touched on it there, is you are the godfather of Diane's 2 children.
That's why I look so proud.
So, the judicial appeal failed.
Yeah, we failed in the High Court, couldn't see a way. But he didn't make us pay the costs, to say us, as if it's me. He didn't make Diane pay the HFE's costs, which really annoyed them, actually. And they then tried to resist permission to appeal. Get this, they said it would be inhumane to give permission to appeal to go to the Court of Appeal because she'd been through enough agony. They're saying this in court with her there. That's their barrister. The judge at least got us an accelerated case. He didn't. He said no. There's no way she's paying costs, win, lose, or draw. And he gave permission to appeal straight away to go to the Court of Appeal. I think his instincts were this wasn't right. He just felt powerless to do anything about it. And in the Court of Appeal, it's a completely different story. But if you're interested, only because we're in the EU. Only because we were in the EU. Without that, I'm sorry, you won't be here.
So what materially changed between the judicial review and the appeal court hearing? What was the legal argument that was able to be developed that was...
Okay, well, the argument was the same, you know, it was, okay, you've got primary legislation, and thank you for the schedule reference. So, yes, you've got that, but you know what? EU law is superior to that, because we signed up in 1972. So if it clashes, even though it's in primary legislation, the courts have to disapply it. You have rights to move through the EU. You've been in touch with clinics, one in particular, I think, in Belgium. So we kind of lined that up. They said, yeah, happy, we don't need a piece of paper. We can treat you. I have a right to access services elsewhere in the EU, unless you can justify the exclusion. How do you justify the need for a signed piece of paper from a man where you know what he would have said, and he's incapacitated so he can't sign? And you needed to be at a higher altitude for that to run. In the Court of Appeal, it does completely change. If you remember, Diane, and all the pressure was on the HFEA. Why are you standing in the way? How can you justify, in this case, the fact that this can't be done, the sperm exists, it's been stored, piece of paper, ha! And that's how that went. Same argument, different forum.
So the Court of Appeal ruling was interesting because they didn't, as I understand it, actually make a decision. They bounced the decision back to the HFEA, which to me seems very strange, because surely a judge or a panel of judges has the right to issue the direction that Diane can use the sperm. Why bounce it back to the
I think they
regulator?
knew exactly what they were doing. What they said was, this does not seem justifiable to us. You haven't thought about it in the right way because you haven't recognised that EU law is in place. You've just focused on that schedule of that statute. We should give you the opportunity to think again. Hint. And they then said, we give what's called liberty to apply. So we give permission to Diane Blood to come back to us. She doesn't need to go back to the High Court. She can come back to us if, hint, your decision is still adverse to her. And I think they knew how controversial it was, they knew how big it was in the press. I think they wanted to give the HFEA the opportunity to come up, to step up and say, now that we know we've got power, now that we know we've got to justify it, we're going to do the right thing. And that was a story in itself. But I think it was a smart thing for them to do.
There was a case called AB versus Victoria in Australia, not that long after, well, maybe a few years, but the judgment, although it wasn't EU law, this is states between various states in Australia. She wasn't from Victoria, but her husband died in Victoria, and she wanted to move it across state boundary, and the judgment was very, very similar, and it bounced it back to the relevant authority in that case to rethink. So maybe they were copying one another.
It's a little bit like learning at school. The headmistress or headmaster saying, go away and think that.
I just would love to have been in that room when they reconsidered that, because I do not think it was over. I think there were some of them didn't want to take the hint, didn't get the hint, and it was just another dramatic twist. But I think they knew that we'd be straight back in court if they repeated the decision.
And really, the public opinion was with you, Diane, wasn't it? Very much so. All the
way.
Surveys and
I have to say, I
opinion
didn't
polls.
know that for a start. I mean, obviously I have an anonymity order for a start, but I didn't really know how the public would feel about it. So I was really blown over by the public support, and when I had Liam, there were people coming into Jessup Hospital in droves, bringing in little woolly knitted jumpers, and I still have boxes and boxes full of cards and letters, and all those clothes I've still kept in boxes, because I was really overwhelmed by the public support that we got.
We didn't know that was going to happen, though, did we?
No.
At the start, we were quite nervous about it, about how it would play out.
Yeah, but when I walked into court on the first day of the High Court, so before the Court of Appeal, and I can remember, I think it was you, but I can't remember, it was certainly one of the legal team came in and said, on teletext, this is how long ago it is, teletext, not internet, there's 90-something% in your favour. And I was like, because I really didn't know.
But it wasn't so straightforward, because although it could be, the treatment could be obtained within the EU, we still had to identify a clinic. And so I wrote to a clinic in France, and one to Germany, one in Spain, one in Switzerland, and one in Greece and one in Italy. And in Greece they said they would do it, and in Belgium they said they would do it, and the others said under no circumstances would we do it. And I learnt years later from Paul de Broy, who was the head of the Belgian clinic, that he had put it to their ethics committee, and after a major discussion lasting a long time, they agreed to do it by one vote. So it was a close-run thing even then.
It was also very lucky in some ways that I did end up with the clinic in Belgium, because they were the clinic that invented ICSI, which it turned out we really needed to use. They were an extremely technologically advanced clinic doing the latest things. So they were a very good clinic. In fact, when I became pregnant with Liam, we thought that he was ectopic because my hormones were all over the show. And my hormones were being monitored here, and then the results sent to Belgium. And the people here were really going, kind of need to give up on this, it's not going well. And Belgium were going, hang on in there. So I wonder, if I had been in a different clinic, would the results have been different? So it was lucky.
Sitting to my far left has been Liam, listening to all this. And I want to bring you now in, Liam. Liam, I sense, but I don't know, that this is all not news to you, and this has just been part of your life growing up.
No, I mean, it's kind of always been sort of, certainly about the story, something that it's kind of always been there. I've never kind of, there was never a point at which somebody kind of went, this is what happened. It's kind of, it's just sort of one of those things that you pick up, but you never quite know where it originated from. It's sort of always been there.
Part of your family story.
Yeah.
Can you remember telling him, Liam, and explaining this whole story, or did it come out in tiny pieces?
It's in tiny pieces. I know when it started college and they started Googling each other. Oh, really? This is something different. Not the usual got drunk on a Friday night and,
Yeah, that was interesting. When I first started college, somebody on my course had a brilliant idea to go and Google everyone.
And I believe you were you are or were on the GCSE syllabus for.
I think it was the A-level RE syllabus, and I think we still are, but that was quite an interesting thing.
we're in the syllabus in America as well, in the US. We keep getting repeated in their biology textbook. Yeah.
Did you study yourself?
No, but it was quite weird because I knew somebody who was, and you know, I was just kind of sat there in tutored with them one morning.
Did you give them the answer?
And was the answer right? I remember reading in your book, Diane, about the many speeches in Parliament and the many times that this case, there were various appeals to change the law, as I recall. And I remember from the time of the early HFEA, there was this welfare of the child clause, which thankfully we don't have in quite the same format. Look, the experts, Liam, the experts were very concerned for you that you might grow up having nightmares or in some way.
Or facing large numbers of
You have an opportunity to put the record straight. I mean, have you had a childhood of nightmares about the father that you never knew?
Not particularly, no. I mean, it's not really a thing of the father that I never knew, because although he's not physically here, you know, he's still kind of, you know, he's still there. We've still got photos of him, and I still, although I never met him, I kind of know who he was. And you know, you kind of get to pick up these things. I mean, there's plenty of families who, you know, perhaps haven't got a full family for one reason or another, and in some ways it wasn't any different to that. And maybe in some ways it was almost easier, because although he's kind of, he's always been there, it wasn't that I knew him and then lost somebody later. He's always been there in that kind of, not hypothetical sense, but, you know, never physically.
Is he like his father?
He looks like him now. Yeah. The world's changed so much, though. It's very hard trying to think, would they have been interested in the same things or that kind of thing. But,
It's very interesting. There's no good reason why there should be anything abnormal about Leanne.
No.
But you can have other circumstances where somebody had cancer, for example, and was dying. You might now realise that, are you passing on a genetic predisposition to cancer? And I think the ethics are that you would have pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to identify that and perhaps in future do something about it. But interestingly, I had the occasion recently to check and see how many reports there were in the world literature of individuals who'd been born after similar circumstances. And there's one paper from Australia reporting 4 young people up to the age of 7. So you should write him up, because he should be the oldest in the world literature.
I think there's one actually. There was somebody Casale, who was born after that. So born after their father's death, and he spoke out when we were talking in the media about Liam, and he would have been about 18 at the time. Kim Casale, his mother, did his cartoons for the Daily Mail. I think he lives in Canada now. So he's not the oldest. I think he was just the first that ended up in a battle, because that predated this stupid law.
We treated the posthumous child thing as a red herring in the legal proceedings, because if you had been pregnant that day in the hospital, it would have been a posthumous child. Baroness Warner, who wrote the Warner Report, was, I think, herself a posthumous child. So this kind of ethical issue about being born, you know, after the father has died, I mean, we just approached it in the court case on the basis that's not what this is about at all. It's not about posthumous birth, and that's not an uncommon.
Well, I could have had the sperm of anybody, even somebody who was dead, just not my own husband, which seemed to me a total nonsense. And then he couldn't be saying the things that he's just saying now, like, we have the photos, I know about him. It would just be a void.
So Liam, you were born in 1998. You have a brother Joel. He was born in 2002. He's 15, I think.
Yes.
He's not with us here tonight.
He was, though. He was here earlier. He had a good look round.
Yeah.
He decided where the best place to
But your legal battle didn't end there, because a curious part of UK law was that after the birth of your two sons, there was no legal mechanism to put Stephen Blood's name as the father on the birth certificate, so you found yourself with another legal battle.
Yeah, tell us, Diane, goody two shoes. This does what she's told. How you reacted to that rule?
Well, to be fair, I knew of that rule from the very moment that the sperm was taken. So the advice I was given at the time the sperm was taken was, well, we can do this, but you can't name the father on the birth certificate. And at that point, I have to say, I really, really didn't care. And it wasn't something that was massively important to me. And in the context of can you or can't you have your children, then it's still a minor sideshow, but I just thought this seems so wrong. When I went to sign for his birth and where the father goes, you just leave it blank. Well, the only other explanation for that is you don't know who the father is. And of course I know who his father is, and this might be important for genetics in the future, but it was still not that important until I then started thinking about a brother. So then I started, the law also changed as well, because the Human Rights Act was introduced, which gave a mechanism to fight this, whereas before that I would have had to go off to, I forget, is it Luxembourg or Strasbourg? I get them mixed up. Luxembourg.
Strasbourg for the ECHR.
Yeah. So the law was changing. I thought that it was wrong. We began arguing about it. They were even saying that maybe they would change it if they never actually got round to doing it. And then I became pregnant with Joel. And then I thought, oh, I'm going to have two children who are going to have the same mother, but unless I'm spectacularly forgetful, can't possibly have the same father. I've had, two children, and I've forgotten the first time, and then it's the same person, and I still can't remember who it was. So, so this seemed really wrong to me. And when you then start filling in things like passport applications, and it asks for who the father is, and it became more important than it was, and there was a mechanism to fight it. So I decided that.
So I'm slightly confused about what the mechanism was. So there was certainly a swell of opinion that the law should be changed in your favour, and I think there were a couple of attempts at private members' bills going through the House, but you still ended up in court, as I recall.
Yeah, what changed was the Human Rights Act in 1998 was introduced in 1990. So that came in, which meant that there was a route to fighting under human rights laws at home versus having to go abroad to do it. So, and it was human rights law that we won under, and the private members' bills were going through at the same time as we were going down a legal route, and people kept saying, no, we'll change it, and they never did, and eventually it was won in court. But when you win in court on the Human Rights Act, it still actually has to be changed in Parliament, and then...
It's another hint. The courts do this thing where they give a hint declaration of incompatibility, which I think you pretty much in the end got uncontested, because they hadn't got an answer to this argument. So she goes from thank God for the EU to thank God for the Human Rights Act on this second challenge. And then, but the remedy is declaration that this is incompatible, over to you, Parliament, hint.
In fact, when we won the birth certificate case, and there was actually another lady, Joanne Tarbuck, who fought that with me, so she was somebody who'd had a little boy, actually, older than Liam, when her husband died of cancer. So we had the two of us just in case consent became an issue, and so we both fought that together. And when we won, the costs in that case, so normally when you win a court case and you win and you get costs, they go away and do some figuring out, and you usually end up with around 60%. And then there's when the judges are really, really cross that somebody shouldn't have brought this case, you can get it on an indemnity basis where you get about 90%, and we were awarded costs on an indemnity basis, which was really the judge saying that this shouldn't have happened in the way that it did, so we were quite pleased about that.
Were you not worried through all of this about the money? It's hugely expensive to employ this guy in his legal. Were you not worried at all?
I have to say my lawyers were very, very kind to me.
I'm going to open it up to the audience in a few moments, but whilst we get the microphones organised, I just wanted to finish on really one kind of more philosophical point, really, and that is why do you think these cases are so emotional? This has not been a one-off. There was the 2008 case that was, I only know as Elle, and the lady may be known now. There was a lady, Beth Warren, more recently, whose husband did store sperm lawfully, but then it ran out of time, and the HFEA were asked to give an extension and refused, and she had to take that to court. There's been cases in Israel. I think there's a case at the moment in Australia that's going through the courts. I mean, I'm just interested to know your views. Why are these cases so high profile, and why does the law seem to deal with it so badly?
I think it ends up with the people making case-by-case decisions. So although what happened in my case, Professor Cooke didn't personally take the sperm, but the sperm was stored on, not quite clear here, and you know, this is a one-shot. There have been other cases where somebody's gone to court and they've said, oh, it's not clear, and the judge has given an order. In some cases, after me, because of my story, where we've discussed this article, there have been people that have just written letters to their wives. So then that is written consent, but it's not on a piece of paper in a clinic. And how do you decide? You know, you've got to put in some mechanism of, hang on, let's give these people a chance to argue this, let's give them a chance to show this bit of paper, this letter, or whatever exists. So there have been cases, and judges in courts mostly seem to come up with compassionate answers, I think. But what I kept asking for at the time, and I never really understood, is why the HFEA couldn't fulfil that role. Why couldn't they make case-by-case decisions? Okay, some might be more complex. You know, it might be a second family, former children might disagree, it might be more complex than it seemed in mind, but there should be a mechanism for letting those people tell their story and somebody make a decision on an individual basis. And I heard some very good arguments recently. I was at a conference actually that Progress Educational Trust did in London, and they were discussing mitochondrial donation, and the HFEA was saying that they looked at each case individually, and they came up with all good reasons why they could do this and why it was compassionate to do so, and there weren't going to be that many cases. And I'm thinking, I said all this about posthumous conception. I still don't see any huge floodgates of loads and loads of posthumously conceived children. Why can't they make a case-by-case decision?
But Allan, the International Federation of Fertility Societies did a survey last year and surveyed 67 countries, and there were 29 that had regulations. The others did not. And so there are constantly questions arising all around the world. For example, in Iran, they have no regulations, but you go to the religious authorities and they create a fatwa that allows you to do it. In Australia and New Zealand, you make application to retrieve the sperm, and then you have to go back to the court to get permission to use it. So there are different circumstances everywhere, and recently Julian Savulescu, the Oxford philosopher, has said, actually all this is a nonsense. That's my words, not his. He said there are only two people that have an interest in this, and that's one is the partner of the deceased, and two, the future child, and they should be the ones that make the decision, which is a very interesting philosophical approach.
I think this is about head and heart. I think if you take the Belgian clinic with their vote by one vote, if you check the HFEA and the way they were during this whole process as I remember it, even in the press I remember an article in the Observer, and I think that you can point to things that I would describe as heartless. And I think the law is sometimes like that. And I think in court, the way I see it, there's this thing going on about a will and a way, where there's, you know, they say, well, there's a will, there's a way. I don't think that's right. I think you need both, and I think you have to be able to wrestle with the dispassionate intellectual exercise of dealing with rules and the law, as well as the, you know, where's the justice here? And I think it's when you do the one without the other, it can become very heartless. And so I think that's, if my answer to why is the law not good at dealing with this would be when it loses that. When the one takes over, when it becomes an exercise of debate, not on some GCSE exam paper, but some, you know, some example of dealing with a case as if it weren't about human beings and it didn't really matter, and it's this kind of intellectual thing. And I think, you know, lawyers and courts tend to do that. Of course, there is a place for that, but I think if we lose the heart of the process, we go off the rails. And I think what the good thing about the legal story here is that on both occasions, with the Court of Appeal, they found a way and they had the will, and then with the Human Rights Act claim, same thing in relation to the naming of the father on the birth certificate.
Ian, any final thoughts from you before we take some questions?
Not particularly.
A hard one for you, I think, because of everyone in the room. You're the one that has a very unique perspective on this.
Yeah, it's been kind of quite unusual because although I've met Mike before, and you know, but sort of certainly discussing some of these things, and you know, the story about
We've been to
my
School of Rock.
yeah, yeah, it's like my christening and some quite interesting little.
You should write a book on
I think last time you met Professor Cooke, you were about so big in his arms.
This is the opportunity to take questions from the audience. We have 2 roving microphones, and if we can, I'd like to take questions in groups of 3. So anybody would like to go first? There's a lady here. Sandy.
What advice would you give to nursing students and social workers in assisting and supporting people going through this, because they are part of the process?
I'll give you a moment to think about your answers to that. Anyone else? Gentleman here goes by the name of Simon.
I just want to clarify a bit of the history with Ian, probably. Ian, you said the sperm retrieval took place in Sheffield, but the fertilisation and I assume the embryo transfer took place in Brussels. Now, why did you feel you couldn't do the ICSI and the transfer in Sheffield? Was it only the HFEA or legal reasons?
Answer that in a moment, if you may. Final question in this triplet. Otherwise, let's go with the first question. Diane, do you have any advice for nursing students and social workers? I know later in life you've been to university and got a different perspective on.
I don't think you probably get to nurses and social workers at the critical, maybe fertility nurses, but I think I seem to be fulfilling that role. My phones are, my details are on the internet and people seem to find me, you know. So, and people find each other as well. I mean, there's a Facebook page for people that were set up by somebody in America, and like many things, you know, people talk to one another.
But I suspect that in most professional, healthcare professional related training programs, this story probably figures, but I'm not sure that anybody is trained, as it were, to deal with that.
But a point made in the literature is that particularly people involved in palliative care do not raise this issue with their patients at a sufficiently early time, and it's obligatory on them to do so. And I think that's quite important. And the second point that's come out very strongly is that if there's been a sudden death, then it really takes quite a long time to grieve and to adapt to the circumstances, and the recommendation would be that there should be 12 months wait before treatment can begin, given whatever the legal background and processes are. But before treatment starts, 12 months should have elapsed, during which time appropriate counselling should have been offered and hopefully received.
Simon's point over there was a technical point. Why wasn't it possible to do the procedures in
My
Sheffield?
understanding that it was illegal to carry out the treatment.
Didn't stop you though.
No, but there's a separation, isn't there, between the process of collecting
That's exactly right. I mean, once we had the court case, this was on the desk of the courts and on the conscience of the courts, and we knew that we could, whatever was going to happen as a result of what the court said could be done. And
I remember sitting with the clinic in Belgium around a table, and I don't know, maybe they didn't fully understand the story from here and the legal process. And we understand that nobody in Britain would treat you. Well, yes, nobody in Britain could treat me. I'm sure Jessup Hospital would have done if they could treat me. This wasn't an ethical thing, it's a legal thing. There's no point in asking anybody else in Britain because they can't legally.
Was it very much part of the legal case that you were offering this as a solution that treatment could
yeah,
be
we were trying to provide the way that I was talking about. If we could get a court that wanted to do it, we wanted to just give the bridge that they could walk across. And I think it came at a price. I mean, not only did they send it back to the HFEA with this hint, but they pretty much said never again. You know, they wrote a judgment, very, very odd really. You know, we're in this situation, very compassionate, this needs a solution, here's the solution, go, you have the right. By the way, should never happen again. And I don't really know what to make of that. That doesn't seem right to me. That it can't be right to say both of those things. She has a right that we are going to vindicate, but no one else should ever be in that position to vindicate that right again. I don't buy that. I think that was a bit of a cop-out. I think they thought it was just such a one-off that all they had to do was to find a way through in this particular case.
You take a question from Adam.
Thank you. I'm Adam Balin. I'm a fertility specialist in Leeds. First, thank you to the panel because I think it's been a fascinating and really sort of thought-provoking discussion. But I actually before you actually started talking, Mike, about this, I was going to ask the question along the lines of what you were just discussing, that I have been approached a few times by consultants in intensive care and have been asked to collect sperm in this sort of situation, and it is an absolute no. You know, we are not allowed to. The world is a different place. I mean, I speak from the perspective of having had a lot of dealings with the HFEA. I think we live in a more compassionate society now, and the HFEA is a very different organisation to how it was 10 or 20 years ago. And the community of reproductive health professionals, I think, you know, has a very different perspective these days, and we are doing so many different things. And so my question really was, why did the wall come down, the shutters come down? Why is it inbred in somebody like me that you don't even explore the history as to why the question is being asked? Our guidance, and I've discussed this with our clinical ethics committee as well, on which I sit, why can't we explore these issues for individuals and start to take an individual-based, compassionate view in the same way? I mean, Diane, you mentioned the HFEA and the mitochondrial, or the sanction for the treatment of mitochondrial disease. There, of course, you can take consent and you can discuss the pros and cons and the risks, but I feel maybe a few more of us should be sticking our necks out in the way that Ian did, and learn from that example, and maybe challenge the HFEA again.
I think time has moved on from where it was. I think that opinions moved on in so many things that I couldn't have imagined being sanctioned 20 years ago, and this seems to have not been reopened.
Other people in the country are thinking about this. You may be aware that the Newcastle group has published extensive discussions between the ethicists and the reproductive biologists, and they've published a process of how to go through this, the ethical principles and the details that need to be recorded. And others have said in other countries that don't have such draconian legislation that provided you document this and you don't have some senior person leaning on everybody else so that true opinions are expressed, as long as the documentation is public so that it's transparent and rational, then there should be every reason why this discussion should take place and action should follow. So we're in a strange situation compared to the rest of the world.
So you could be in this position, right? You could have somebody like Diane saying, will you please do this? How many others in the room, in their work, could be in that position? Are there any others? Okay, so can I put a scenario to you? Just picking up on your question. Is that okay? So you're in a situation, and it's a tragic situation like the one that is at the beginning of Diane's story and Liam's story. And somebody says to you, will you please take this sperm because I want to go to court and I want to use the Human Rights Act and I want the law to decide. I'm not asking you to use it, I'm just asking you to give me a chance. If you don't do it, I can't bring my court case. I'm not going to get a court order to say take it. I need you to take it. We'll abide by what the court says, but that's what I want you to do. I mean, you may not want to, but I would just love to know if that scenario arose in a practical environment, what you would do. Now, I can give you my take on it, but I'm a lawyer.
I'm going to throw that back to Adam, who's the closest to the microphone. You can edit this out of the video, Adam. It doesn't go well.
Well, I mean, this evening has made me think that if I was asked, I would like to think I'd do what Ian did. I have been in situations, different scenarios, in which I have acted on what I felt was right and have then got involved with the law. So I have done that, but not in this situation. Because we just have it seem to have it inbred in ourselves that the shutters came down, Diane managed to escape just before, or just managed to push it through, but then it's an absolute non-starter. I mean, through the British Fertility Society, we've just published a whole guidance on fertility preservation, but this doesn't figure.
See, one of the problems with that,
probably should.
One of the problems with that, and I totally get that, because that is what the Court of Appeal said, and I was just criticising it a few minutes ago. But how can you have another test case to see whether the law has moved on, to see whether the Supreme Court might take a different view, to see whether the Human Rights Act might take you to a different place than EU law took, unless you have the starting point without which lawyers and courts can do nothing?
Because, of course, the Human Rights Act in Britain didn't exist when I fought my first court case.
Exactly.
And Beth Warren's judgment was entirely on the Human Rights Act. Very strongly in
I think it's quite important. The literature is now saying that every institute, this is in other countries, and particularly in the US, every clinic should have a protocol for dealing with this. And an analysis from a clinic in New York suggested that of the previous 22 cases that they'd had, 18 did not follow the most basic steps. So I think if you're going to get to the point where you have a test case, it's really important, A, to have a protocol, and B, to make sure that it's followed meticulously so that you've got a solid case to start with.
And we present that protocol at our annual HFEA inspection and say, do you agree?
Don't answer that. There's a question at the back, and I think there's also one over here, Sandy, to your right. So can we go to the back first?
Surely as Parliament still insists on that.
We can't hear that, I'm afraid. Can you go to the left? Sandy, go to your question while we sort that.
Hi, I'm Karen from Leeds. Bizarrely, my point was very similar to Adam's actually, and my question was to Professor Cooke was, in that scenario where you literally got not long to decide, you didn't know that the woman, you didn't have a relationship with them, how did you decide that that's what you wanted to do and that was the right thing to do? Coming from a professional, and you know, and as Adam said, I think we'd all like to do the right thing, and I think obviously this case proved it. But what was going through your head during those hours when you had to make that decision?
Well, it wasn't the hours in which I had to make the decision, it was about 15 seconds, because that was the duration of the telephone call. Between the time the question was posed and the question I had to give an answer was about 15 seconds, and I described the two thoughts that I had. One was that I was privileged because I had actually been the clinician who had had the original discussion with Baroness Hale, as it turned out. And Professor Hale, she was a professor of law at that stage. And and I knew that the scenario that we were faced with had never been imagined. And I thought it was quite wrong to take a decision out of context, and I thought that was completely unreasonable. And that was the fundamental reason why I decided to go ahead. The second one was that I had to make a decision, and if I made the wrong decision, I would never have the chance to do that again.
Can I just make a point on the appeal court judgment? It's often said, oh, it was illegal to take the sperm and to store it. Actually, we ran a whole load of arguments about best interest for taking the sperm, and the Court of Appeal kind of ducked. They just didn't rule on it at all. They didn't say, no, it's illegal to take it. What they said was it was illegal to store it. So, I suppose technically, maybe you could take sperm and magically not store it. Then,
there's a question at the back.
In which case, you've got 36 hours to do it.
Well, I think surely one of the problems is you've got to overcome the written consent. Parliament still 20 years later insists on written consent. Now, at the end of the day, Parliament, we democratically elect Parliament. I'm totally sympathetic to Diane Blood. I think it's fantastic. I think what Professor Cooke did is correct. But you've got that major thing, the legislation enshrines written consent. And there's been a number of cases recently with clinics where there's not been proper consent followed. I mean, I think of the Leeds case where I think a black man's sperm was inseminated into a white woman by mistake. So obviously he didn't consent to that. You've had other cases, Natalie Evans' case, and you've had those recent cases where there's been problems with consent forms in London. And I think the president of the family division, James Mumby, was very concerned and vexed about that. So I think that you've got a major problem. Written consent is still a major ethical and legal pillar of the legislation. So I suppose it's really just a comment rather than what do you think of that? I mean, the problem is Parliament hasn't actually changed the law. I don't think there's any inclination to change the law actually at the minute.
Let me tell you a story. Parliament did change the law on cohabiting partners and the succession to public authority pension. Okay, why is that relevant? When they decided to equalise it, they said you don't have to be married, you can be a cohabiting couple and you can inherit your partner's local government pension, provided you got a piece of paper that's signed. Now, you didn't need a piece of paper signed if you were married, you only needed one if you were cohabiting. That case went to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal unanimously said that that was human rights compatible. It was a bright line rule, it made sense, everyone could operate it. It then went to the Supreme Court. This has never been to the Supreme Court. These shutters have never been to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court unanimously, Baroness Hale, said it's a rubbish rule. Signed piece of paper, what a nonsense. Why should you need one? It's form over substance, it's unjust, etc., etc. I think for me the message is, how can these things be tested unless people are, and I will choose my words carefully, unless people are as heroic as that.
I think as well, can I just kind of add there, because there's all this thing about having written consent on a form, but it kind of comes back to who designs the form to, to provide that written consent, and who officially decides that that is correct. I think, going on what Mike just said, so long as, if there is some mechanism to prove that, consent is there, not necessarily in a written form, but it might be, just on the wrong form. And I think that's, something that I've certainly heard a few times, where something exists but it's not on the right format, so somebody can't acknowledge it. Why is there this thing of everything has to be in a set format? Because actually, something that somebody can prove is correct might well be just as valid as something else that's just been written on an official form.
Straight to the Supreme Court.
Consent also isn't necessarily the most up to date. There are plenty of people that sign things that have had conversations with people afterwards going, now I'm going to have to get around to changing that will or whatever it is. And so, I think there's a lot to be said for what loved ones know and say.
And that operates in a number of other countries as well.
Our time is coming to a close, ladies and gentlemen, but we do have time for one more round of questions. Sarah, your hand was up first, but if there are any more, please declare yourselves now.
So, okay, we've got power. We decide written consent, not necessary. What would we have instead? What would you think we'd need to show to be satisfied? Technology. I mean, I remember reading a case in Israel where a man who was single was killed due to he don't think he had a partner at the time, and his mum managed to dredge up a video of him at a family event saying, "Oh yeah, one day I'd like a family," and that was enough for the judge in Israel. So what would be the the strength of the consent that we'd need to treat people? Would we have a new rule? We just have a case-by-case basis?
There has been an ethical discussion about this in the literature. One is that not only that you need witnesses to support the fact that these statements or evidence has been made, and secondly that the person did not change their mind. And both of those, they were the two criteria that were applied.
Question over there.
Hi, it's not really a question, it's a comment more. So rather than obtaining consent, why not have an opt-out?
In the same way that organ donation.
Yeah, like organ donation, because in a way it's another donation, isn't it? So why not have opting out instead?
Michael.
Well, that presupposes that there would be routine sperm retrieval, and I think that would be an extraordinarily invasive procedure and not likely to comply with the wishes of the majority of people. I think it's the exception that is currently possible, and maybe that's the way it should stay.
My husband had an organ donation thing, which specifically said he wished to donate everything except his eyes. So,
and I think in law, the way that the law deals with reproductive tissues is very different from the way it deals with everything else.
Obviously, that wasn't relevant.
But I think it kind of, some things there are a protocol, that do need a form. There is a protocol there to actually, look at the forms when somebody is able to sign them. And actually, something like this, people just don't think about asking for these forms. They're not thought about as, until it's too late, and that's why we end up with these issues of, well, is there another way that consent was given?
Your final chance, ladies and gentlemen. Question here.
Thank you. So just following on the consent, I was taken by something, Ian, you said earlier about a philosopher who had said there's only two people's opinions in matter. And those people's opinions were the person having a child and the project. It wasn't a partner. So I wonder if you could expand a bit more on what the philosophical position here was.
No, I think either I misstated it or you misunderstood it. It was the partner, the spouse usually, and the future person. That doesn't mean that there are not other interested parties, and the interested party would certainly be the pregnant woman, who may be the former spouse, but it could also be a gestational carrier. So it's quite a complicated...
So the deceased's opinion does matter?
Oh, absolutely it does matter, and that would be an interested party, yes.
Because I thought that would be a nice philosophical point for a philosopher to make. I call myself an ex-philosopher, and I was wondering to myself, would I care what somebody did with my sperm after I was dead? And my answer is no, I'm dead.
Well, others don't share that view.
But there's a question here, it must be the final one.
So just out of interest, was the HFA asked to come along to represent their role in this whole story?
Interesting. Sarah Norcross.
That was something that was invited or not? No.
Short and sweet, no deal with it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating evening, and I think a once in a lifetime get together. In the back room, I made the suggestion before we walked out that we should all sign a copy of Diane's book as a little memento, and we've done so, and I'm going to treasure that for the rest of my days. I'd like to thank everyone in the university who helped organise this. Polly and her team, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Progress Educational Trust for coming up with the idea and coming all the way from London to Sheffield to be here tonight, as well as you might. Please fill out your evaluation forms. Everyone would like to know how this event went, and we can make future events better as a consequence. And please, if you have any spare change, consider making a donation to the Progress Educational Trust as you leave. Diane, Ian, Michael, and Liam, thank you very much for being so honest and candid. Ladies and gentlemen, have a safe journey.